What's the real difference between good writing and great writing? It might not be what you think. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the secret language of student writing. We'll uncover these hidden patterns that show exactly how kids learn to build powerful, persuasive arguments, one connecting word at a time. So, you might be thinking the secret is just a bigger vocabulary, right? Using fancier words. Well, not quite. It turns out the real game changer is how writers connect their ideas. There's this kind of secret glue that holds the most complex and sophisticated arguments together. And that secret glue actually has a technical name: linking adverbials. Just think of them as the signposts in our writing. Words like therefore, however, and for example. They literally guide the reader through your thoughts. But here's the crazy part. For years, researchers were totally stumped about how we actually learn to use them. Yeah, they knew these connecting words were absolutely crucial for mature writing. But every single time they tried to measure how students' skills developed, the results were, well, they were all over the place. It created this massive contradiction in the research. And this is where it gets really weird. I mean, look at this. Some studies showed a clear increase in these linking words as students got older. Makes sense. But then, other studies found the exact opposite. No change, or even a decrease. So which was it? Were young writers getting better or worse? The data just made no sense at all. So what on earth was causing all this confusion? Well, it turns out the answer was hiding in plain sight, disguised by 4 of the most common words we use every single day. Researchers had this breakthrough idea. They thought, what if these 4 incredibly common words, and, but, so, and then, were actually masking the real trend? See, we learn these words so early and use them so often that they can basically drown out the development of all the other, more sophisticated words kids are learning. So the researchers did something really simple. They just reran their analysis, but this time they took those 4 words out of the equation. And just like that, the fog lifted. A clear and honestly fascinating picture of how students develop as writers finally came into focus. And with that clear data, the first major discovery popped right out: what they call the great genre divide. This showed that the type of writing, say a story versus an essay, isn't just a different task. No, it's like learning 2 completely different languages. And this chart just lays it all out perfectly. Look over on the left, that's literary writing, stories. The use of these linking words is low, and it just kind of stays flat over time. But now look at the right, that's for non-literary stuff like essays. The use starts way higher and then just skyrockets as students get older. It's a huge difference. And when you actually dig into the kinds of words being used, the difference becomes even more obvious. In story writing, the connecting words are almost all about time. Soon, eventually, a few days later. Their whole job is just to organize events in order. But the language of essays, that's a whole different ballgame. Here, the linking words are all about logic and structure. Students are learning to use words like furthermore to add a point, for example, to illustrate it, and in conclusion, to wrap it all up. This is a totally separate skill set. But believe it or not, the story gets even more detailed. Because even within academic writing, it turns out that different subjects have their own different rules. Students aren't just learning the language of essays, they're learning the language of science and the language of history and the language of English class. Take a look at this quote. It's from a student's science report. Notice the linking words. First, then, next, after that. This is the language of process, right? It's about describing sequential steps in an experiment, a very, very specific way of communicating. And this slide lays out these subject-specific dialects so clearly. In English class, students learn to use here to point to a quote in a text. In humanities, they might use consequently to argue cause and effect. And in science, like we just saw, it's all about process words like first and next. It's incredible when you think about it. Each subject is quietly teaching its own unique language. So when you put all of this together, the genre divide, the subject dialects, you can actually map out a really clear path that students take on their way to becoming mature, sophisticated writers. This journey really starts around year 6, with those informal, spoken-style words like well and anyway. But by year 9, their toolkit starts to expand. And by year 11, you see a real mastery of these formal academic linkers like furthermore, and ultimately, especially when they're writing essays. So the key insight here is this. Becoming a better writer isn't about replacing simple words. It's about building a bigger, more specialized toolbox and knowing exactly which tool to use for which job. That shift from just saying so to using consequently, that's not just a vocabulary change, that's a cognitive leap. And just how different are these toolkits? This number is staggering. The analysis found that a whopping 74% of the frequently used linking words were distinctive to either literary or non-literary writing. They are fundamentally separate languages. Okay, so we've cracked the code and we've mapped out the journey. But what's the big takeaway? What does this all actually mean for how we teach writing and how students learn it? So here's what it all comes down to. First, there's no such thing as just good writing. It's a whole collection of different skills. Writing stories is one of them, but it won't really prepare you for writing a history essay. That's because every academic subject is teaching its own distinct language. Real growth as a writer means expanding your toolkit from just a few basic connectors to a whole range of precise, formal, and powerful tools. And this brings us to the big, final question. If every single school subject is teaching its own unique academic dialect, how do we actually help students become fluent in all of them? That's the real challenge and the real journey this research so brilliantly reveals.